So we've got Senator Cramer with us now. Senator, in one moment, I want to get your reaction first and foremost, maybe even most importantly today. Happy birthday, sir.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks. It's great. I've been spending some time with grandchildren today. It's very nice.
Well, we appreciate you.
But I have to tell you, it's a pleasure, Chris, and I want you guys to know it first. I want you to run with this. Martians have landed on the Capitol Mall. They're meeting with Nancy Pelosi tonight to talk about impeachment proceedings that will begin tomorrow. It's really big stuff, and I want you to have it before BuzzFeed gets it. Then they can take the story, and they can question me about it tomorrow.
It's really stunning to watch, sir, and you know, I think that's why I set it up the way I did, to say these people are saying, hey, we've got to have this mea culpa, this look in the mirror conversation, and then not even in 24 hours, I mean, you lay out the sort of those check boxes I did of the perfect person for them to have Trump derangement syndrome, and unfortunately it blinds them to sometimes what's real. Sir, I want to bring this up real quickly because I think it's interesting dialogue now in the context of what we've seen here. Just last weekend, the week before that, the New York Times ran with this counterintelligence story that Trump's a Russia agent. Right. But in 2016, I want to see if you're open to doing something like this again. You said, hey, look, we need to pull these media people in and have a congressional hearing. You said you were alarmed, and I'm quoting you now, by recent polls and studies which seem to confirm that our national network news have devolved from fact-based journalism to surreptitious propaganda. I think many people would agree you nailed it back then. What can we do now?
Well, it's gotten a lot worse, Chris, and my point at that time was not aimed at all of the media, because clearly the National Enquirer, BuzzFeed, I mean, they're not real, they're not serious. You got Mike McFeely at the Forum. These aren't journalists. These aren't people that others take seriously until lately, somehow now they matter. What bothered me then and still bothers me is when the networks themselves, who are riding free on beachfront property owned by the taxpayers of this country with the great privilege of using prime spectrum to spew their propaganda, they ought to be better. And I don't think it's too much. It's not censorship, and I know all the group formerly known as mainstream media get all uptight when I talk like this. I'm not talking about censorship. What I'm talking about is just fundamental, responsible fairness when you're using the people's airwaves. So it's not gotten any better. What can you do? I don't know, because as soon as you try to take them on, they try to take you down. So
let's move on, sir. One last question. Does President Trump right? I want to see if you agree with him. Is President Trump correct in his assessment that the fake news is the enemy of the people?
Chris, I hesitate to use language because I value our free and open press so much. Now, they don't value my opinion nearly as much as I value their right to be free press. But it does bother me, Chris, when mainstream media, now I'll just tell you, this network, this local network owned by Great TV, called for a response from me about the Cohen story that was released by BuzzFeed. I mean, BuzzFeed, when did we start looking at BuzzFeed for a source? And by the way, their sources were neither named, nor was the evidence provided that supposedly these unnamed sources had. So we've got to do a lot better. But they don't police themselves. I guess this is why no one pays any attention to them anymore.
Yeah, and I would encourage people to check out one of the authors of that BuzzFeed story. I mean, coke addict, had a full story about the indictment of Karl Rove. Let's move on to what matters now for the people is this government shutdown. Sure. Is Trump winning this government shutdown fight?
Well, I think he's winning with his base. I think Democrats are winning with their base. I think it's the middle ground that's available for influence, and I think he knocked it out of the ballpark. When Nancy Pelosi wouldn't negotiate with him, he negotiated on her behalf. He went beyond generous with his offer on Saturday. We're adding to that generosity in the Senate by adding the $12+ billion for disaster relief. And he couldn't ask for more of a starting point for a negotiation that, by the way, we'll be able to vote this week on reopening the government and funding modestly a small part of border protection, while also funding things like USDA and the IRS and everybody's favorite agencies, and yet she says it's a non-starter. I'm absolutely baffled by it.
Sir, we'll get to the negotiation piece in a moment. I want to ask you this, because to me, the President of the United States getting up on a Saturday afternoon for a pretty important announcement just seemed like an odd time. And I'm asking this question in this context. Were there D.C. swamp senators, rhinos, working on a back-end deal to have a 60-plus vote veto override with no money for wall funding?
None that I'm familiar with, Chris, and I'm pretty familiar with the negotiations in the Senate. There were some senators, as we know, widely known, headed by Lindsey Graham, that were trying to talk the president into, to maybe a 3-week short-term continuing resolution while we negotiated a larger, under this public spotlight border deal, but never one that would get 60 votes and that would be able to sustain an override. That was never discussed. It would be futile for sure. And now, though, we have a deal on the table that is, like I said, beyond generous. If it doesn't get 60 votes in the Senate, then nobody's serious about funding the government or certainly about securing our borders.
Are you saying this deal as is going to hit the Senate floor and you're expecting to pick up 7 Democrat votes for it?
I don't know if we can pick up 7, but I know we'll pick up some. Hopefully we would get to 7. Chris, how does a senator, for example, from California, vote against funding, not only border security, but the USDA, the IRS? How about relief from the wildfires? I just don't know how it gets much more generous for them. Plus, remember, that we're going to start this in the Senate. So that means it goes to the House where the real negotiation will take place. I don't think any of us are naive enough to think that Nancy Pelosi is just going to roll over and pass it as is. I suspect that other negotiations will begin and the pot will get sweetened. I think there are enough Democratic senators with their heads screwed on straight enough to at least want that negotiation to take place.
But they're saying, sir, hey, we need to open up the government first, then we'll negotiate. One example, Senator Warner is now floating the idea of, hey, why don't we at least pay these people so they're getting paid since they're working, and even the people that aren't working,
right.
Let's negotiate then. Would you vote for something like that?
Well, I'm actually co-sponsor of Ron Johnson's bill that pays the people that are working while they're working rather than waiting till later. But whether that happens or it doesn't happen, if you're in a negotiation, you don't give one side everything they want and the other and say we'll give you everything you want. You just continue talking to us about the things that we want. That's just nonsense. And it's to start a negotiation as Nancy Pelosi has by saying it's a non-starter when I don't think she appreciates how difficult it is for conservatives to vote for this package that they don't agree with, but they're willing to do that to get the negotiations going. We'll pass it. I believe we will pass it this week. The House will have that opportunity, and we can open the government in the Senate. I don't know what the House is going to do, but there's going to be a lot of pressure. Remember, government workers in California, places like that, are going to be putting the pressure on their members of Congress to vote for this package. Whether they do or they don't, it's hard to say. I will say this, Chris. I have some empathy for what Nancy Pelosi is going through. She's got a very radical left wing that she can't be speaker without. And just like we had when we were in the majority, John Boehner and Paul Ryan had to deal with 20, 30 members that wanted to make a point more than make a difference, and that makes it difficult to put together a majority. So she wants to be speaker more than she wants to open this government. Then she probably won't deal. But this is why the president goes on TV on a Saturday, goes around her and talks to her people directly, right into the camera, and get that very Reagan-esque, get that pressure applied by the people.
We shall see how this thing plays out. It sounds like you guys are probably going to vote on it on Thursday.